Hello, everyone.
How's it, Kent?
Good, good. Thank
Hi,
you.
good afternoon, Kent. Hi, Andrew. Welcome.
A beautiful day in Cape Town.
It's a beautiful day in Joburg. I'm glad you finally got a good day there.
Yeah, well, eventually.
Yeah, we contended with quite a bit of wind. I think last week I told you my sukkah flew down once.
Oh,
It lasted us. It lasted us until Shmini Atzeret night, and then on Friday night we ate our meal Friday night in the sukkah. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, the whole schach got blown off. So that was it. Anyway, Baruch Hashem, it lasted pretty much the whole time. And we managed to celebrate. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Let's get started. I'll share the screen for the text. And as usual, at the end, we'll have a chance for a little bit of chat or questions if anybody has. Let's get the screen shared. And we'll just mute everyone. To limit the disturbances. Well done. And here we go. Okay, so we are chapter 7 of the laws of Brachot. And as we'll see right at the opening sentence of this chapter, what the Rambam is going to share in this particular chapter is not so much halakha, strict legal guidance, but more what he refers to as minhagim. And we'll see that it's really like etiquette, certain type of correct etiquette at a meal. So we begin. The sages will want to follow many different customs at meals, and this is all in a way of derech eretz, right? We're familiar with the term derech eretz. It's here he translates it in a manner of behavior. It's a respectable way to behave. And these are some of those minhagim, some of those customs. When you're about to begin a meal, would you do so by washing hands? So the one of greatest stature should wash first. And then the others will come and sit, join together with him. And when they come to the area where they're going to eat, and now what we've got to kind of imagine over here is we're not talking about the way we sit around a table that is elevated and everybody has a chair. The Rambam is talking about a scenario where people would actually recline during the meal. And as we'll see further in Halacha, each person would also have their own kind of separate table that was brought in front of them. And when we say recline, it's not just that they were in a chair on the arm and like leaning over, they would lie down like we see in pictures of ancient times. So this is what would happen. The most prominent, and I guess that would be left for discussion in different scenarios, exactly who is considered the most prominent. But the idea is that the most prominent would wash first, everybody would then follow, and then this most prominent individual would be the first to take their place, lying himself down. If there was a second person, then the one who is kind of second to him would then seat himself below him. Lamata would mean to the side of his feet, I guess, imagining that he's reclining out. And Hayushlosha, if there were three, then mitos are three kind of these beds that they would recline on. Gadol Mesa Barosh. So again, the first individual, the most prominent, would sit himself at the head, the second above him, and the third to his feet. The idea of Yaz really would be the second would be to the right and the third to the left of this individual. And then the order of who begins eating. So the host should be the one to say the blessing of the bread. Then he breaks the bread or cuts the bread. And if there are guests at the table, then it should be the guest who leads the benching, so they can include, as we learned, I think it was yesterday or previously, that you make the special prayer within the benching, honoring the host. It was earlier in the halacha. And if you're talking about people that are in one home, in other words, either it's a shared residence, but you don't have guests per se, so then the most prominent should be the one to both break bread, make the blessing, and be the one to lead the benching at the end of the meal. He should not cut or break the bread and pass it out until each individual has a bit of salt or some type of spread that they're going to eat together with the bread. We're talking about a time again when the bread, it was not common to eat it plain and dry because the quality wasn't great or the taste wasn't great. So they would always eat it with a bit of salt. We're not talking here about the salt that you would dip in as a throwback, so to speak, to the practices on the altar. Here we're talking about simply about bringing flavor to the bread. And the idea is that you should be able to have the food ready in the way that you're going to eat it when you make the blessing. So the one who's going to be leading the blessing, Hamotzi, should not break the bread until everybody has what they need in front of them to be able to eat the bread, either salt or some type of spread, unless everybody's intending to actually eat this bread dry as it is, because you don't want to have that gap, basically. A person shouldn't break off too small of a piece or cut too small of a piece because it looks like you're being stingy. You also shouldn't break off large pieces because, and he defines what is a large piece, more than what we call the size of an egg. That's an halachic measurement. Because then it looks like he's being kind of gluttonous. Or b'Shabbos, however, on Shabbos you can break off larger pieces. When you break the bread, you should break it from the part that's cooked the best, the nicest. Now, in halacha 4, he's going to talk about generally meals during the week. The ideal way to perform the mitzvah of making the blessing of the bread is to make it over an entire loaf that you can then break or cut and hand out. In other words, and we'll learn that on Shabbos, obviously, you need 2 loaves. Here we're talking about even on a regular meal, ideally you should have a complete loaf, even if it's a small loaf, but it should be complete if that's what you're making the bracha over. He says, what happens if you have now a full loaf of bread made from barley? Because as we've learned previously, bread is determined by any of the grains. Now, barley is obviously an inferior grain to wheat. So you have a full loaf of barley, but only a piece of bread from wheat. So he says, what should you do then? What you should do is you should put them together. So that when you make the blessing and then break the bread, you should break a bit of the wheat bread, which is the preferable in quality, and also be breaking at the same time from the barley, which is preferable because it is whole. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, as we know, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, one is obligated to make the blessing, the initial blessing of the bread, on 2 loaves. And what you do is when you make the blessing, you hold both of them, but then you only have to cut or break from one of them. You don't have to utilize both of them. You may very well be familiar that the reason, where does this halacha come from? It recalls the double portion that fell of manna in the desert on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov, when they weren't able to collect it otherwise on the day itself. Excuse me. Halacha 5. What you should do then is break the bread, and then you should pass out the bread in front of the people, and then the person takes it. You shouldn't hand it directly into their hand. Unless a person is in mourning, that is the only situation when you would hand directly into somebody's hand. So that would mean either you put it out on the table in front of them, or common what we do today, for example, at Shabbos, we would cut it up, maybe put it onto a tray, and you pass the tray around, and each person helps themselves. And the one who cut the bread, who broke the bread, should be the first to eat. And those who are joining around the table should not eat from their bread until the one at the head has eaten. And also he should wait not to eat the bread until those who he's including in his blessing have said amen to his blessing over the bread. Now, if you've got the host who is the one that's breaking the bread, but he wants to show honor to someone at the table, maybe he's hosting his teacher or somebody who considers is much greater than him in his wisdom, he can set it aside and allow them to eat first. So again, so it's not strict halakha that he has to be the first one to eat. He may defer that place of honor, so to speak, to allow another to eat first. This is separate now. So we've spoken about breaking bread handing out the bread, making the blessing, who washes first, who benches first. Now he's talking about where you were eating from a communal plate, a communal tray. So you've got a tray of herring that everybody's eating from. So if there were two people sharing a plate, and one of them pauses or walks away for a moment, so the other one should stop eating. Again, this is what he calls derech eretz. If there are three people and one person walks away or pauses from eating, then the other two don't have to stop. But if two of them pause, then the third one does have to wait for them to start again. It's not nice manners, right? But like he said, repeating kind of what he said above, if one of them finished, the two don't have to wait for the one, but they can continue eating until they're done. This is something that our mothers always told us: don't speak while you're eating. And the Rambam says the reason over here is not to put yourself into a dangerous situation. The danger that we're concerned about over here is that if you're speaking, you may end up choking. And therefore, he says, therefore, if someone is served wine during the meal, each person should make the blessing on their own, not a communal blessing. Why? Because if one person is going to say the blessing on behalf of everybody, and then somebody's in the middle of eating and they're going to need to answer amen, they're going to answer amen, they may end up choking while they're trying to swallow. Another matter of good manners, one should not look at a person while they're eating, nor should you look at the portion of food on their plate. And this is a matter of not to cause embarrassment. Halacha 7. If somebody, an attendant who's serving the meal, should not eat together with them. Now it's considered compassionate to give this attendant, assistant, the butler, whoever it is serving, a taste of each of the portions, each of the dishes that he's serving, in order that he should be satisfied. In other words, you don't want him to be serving food, everybody's eating and enjoying, and he's sitting there waiting is going to eat later. Let him taste of each dish. Now, if you give him wine, which is also a nice thing to do, right? Let him participate. He should make a bracha on each cup that is handed to him. And the reason is because the drinking that he's going to do is dependent on them, not on him. In other words, if I'm sitting at the meal and I'm going to make a blessing on wine, I only have to make it on the first cup, not each time I drink another cup of wine. That's because I can intend that I'm going to be having more wine. And when I make the first blessing on the first cup, I'm including any wine that I may continue to drink later in the meal. But because this attendant is getting it at the will of somebody sitting at the table, he can't be sure that he's going to be getting more wine. So he makes the blessing on the cup that he's given. If he's given another cup, we don't say that it's included in the first blessing. He must make another blessing. Halacha 8. Somebody has to leave the table in order to relieve himself to urinate. They should wash one hand before coming back. And the assumption of here is that the person only utilized one hand that would have touched otherwise covered parts of his body when he went to relieve himself. So you wash that hand and you come back to the table. If somebody left the table for a while to go and speak to somebody, in other words, he spent a bit of time away from the table, then he should wash both hands when he comes back in. And the assumption is that if one is not conscious of where they're putting their hands, it's likely it would have touched a part of the body that's otherwise covered, and that requires washing again before you come to the table. If you've gotten together for drinks, tea or beer or something, then if somebody leaves, they should come back, they should wash their hands in the presence of those that they are with, and then kind of rejoin the circle. And the idea there is, as he says, why does he wash his hands there where everybody is gathered? People shouldn't say that he wasn't considerate to wash his hands because he reasoned that there's no food anyway, I don't have to wash my hands. It's interesting how we see these laws that were kind of laws of etiquette, which really foundationally are really laws, I guess, that we can understand today as hygienic. And even though they are here codified in Jewish law, I'm not sure that it was the practice necessarily in the broader society. And we know that this often became a point of contention or a point of a reason why others would look at Jews askance and point this out as something negative. But it certainly protected us practically by keeping us clean and so on, and more hygienic than the general populace. Halacha 9. So now the next ones he's talking about is just ways in which you don't want to cause the food to become a little bit disgusting in front of you. He says, you don't place raw meat on bread. You don't pass a full glass over bread. Both of these are the same reason, because if it gets wet, then the bread's going to get soggy. You also wouldn't lean or place a plate for support onto that has liquids in it or food that might spill over onto the bread. And also wonders, so those first ones are because you don't want it to become soggy. This one is we don't throw bread because we don't throw bread. It's disrespectful. And the next one is also you don't throw foods that don't have any type of shell around it, because if it falls to the ground or wherever it lands, it gets schmutzig, it gets dirty, right? You go into Tutzim, he says like berries, novim, and grapes, v'teinim, and figs, because they become disgusting. Now this, when I read this, I was very fascinated. He says it's permissible to cause wine to flow through pipes in the halls of the bridegroom. This almost sounds like, what are those, like when they're pouring a beer down those funnels. But I guess they did something like that. I'm not sure. So it seems like in a celebratory environment, that was okay. You'd pour wine down a funnel. And you can also throw roasted grains and nuts towards the bridegroom. This is as long as it's in the summer, because if it falls on the ground, it gets a little bit dusty, you can wipe it off. We're assuming that the floors were earth. So if it roasted, it was somewhat hard, you could wipe off the dust. And obviously the idea of throwing it creates joy and so on. But it would not be permissible in the winter, because obviously then the ground is most likely it's muddy, and that would just be disgusting. And he says generally we've got to be careful. We mentioned bread and those things that would specifically become disgusting, or by if they're not covered and so on. But he says generally don't spoil food or other drinks by how he translates contemptuous and derisive manner, pushing it away, throwing it aside. Food is to be treated respectfully. Halacha 10. Now this is also interesting. And to a degree, we've got to be sensitive to this, although I think circumstances, they are a little bit different. But he says, if you're sitting at somebody's table and you're a guest, one is not permitted to take from the plate that's been handed to them and give it to the children of the host. Because could very well be that what the host served you was all that they had. And now what you did is you've passed them to somebody else and they have nothing else to give you. That would cause them to be embarrassed. It sounds like almost like if there might be a situation of, what do we call it? FHB. The mom says to the kids, family's got to hold back a little bit. And then they went and they served the host, and the host looked at the kid next to him, the guest, and the guest looks at the kid, sees doesn't have anything, and passes it on, assuming that there's more to come. But they don't know. Maybe there's no more to come. So you're not allowed to just hand it out without asking, because you maybe cause a situation that's embarrassing. One should not send to his friend a barrel of wine with oil that is floating on top of it. Basically, what would you would have barrels of wine, and often they would have oil available at the table in order to dip the bread in. Because oil floats, so sometimes they'd put a layer of oil at the top of the barrel so that it would be easily accessible. But the bottom of the barrel would be filled with wine. Now, oil, it seems, was more desirable, and they would use it. So he's saying, don't send a barrel that's basically wine with a layer of oil at the top to your friend, because maybe he's going to think that this is a barrel filled of oil. And then he's going to invite people over, assuming that he's got a full barrel of oil. And what he's going to find is after they dip a few times and it gets absorbed, that the oil is done, and now he's left with wine, and he's going to be embarrassed. He says, in any similar activity, there may cause the host to be embarrassed, one should be conscious of this and be careful. Okay. Yud Aleph Halacha 11. Once you've finished eating, you should remove the table. Remember, I said they used to have these reclining chairs, and each person had their own kind of table. So you must move that away, and you must clear up the ground. Why? Before you wash your mayim achronim that we learned about. Shemi yeshayru sham perurin sheyesh ben kazayis osel alech bahen v'lichasaren. You must move the table and clear the space because you're not allowed to pour water onto. He says there may be left over there an amount of crumbs that have fallen off that would equal a kazayit, which is like the size of an olive. He says, and walking over bread or pouring water on bread as much as a kazayis, he says is prohibited. So if you're about to wash your hands for mayim achronim, you don't want to mistakenly cause this problem. I guess you're disrespecting the bread, creating the soggy pieces over there. But he says if they're so you got to clean it away. He says, but if there are small pieces of bits that that are smaller than the size of an olive, no problem. You can just sweep it out to kind of destroy it. Halacha 12. Now here we're talking about when they bring water for the mayim achronim, for the water that you wash your fingers with at the end of the meal. Who washes first? The one that is going to lead the benching. He's going to point out to the Rambam that this is not a matter of so much showing respect, but more practical thing. You don't want to leave the person lingering with dirt on their fingers. Remember, the mayim achronim was primarily about removing the salt that may cause damage to one's eyes. And that, so as he says, because you don't want the most prominent individual sitting there with dirty hands, waiting for others to wash their hands. There's not a halachic concern so much about that type of respect, practical thing that he shouldn't be sitting there with dirty hands. And then one at a time, each one will wash one after the other. And he makes this point. He says, you don't invite somebody to wash their hands first as a sign of honor. There's no honor in that. He says no honor when it comes to cleaning your hands. And as an aside, he mentions there are other scenarios where it would not be, there's no honor in extending the rights to somebody first. What's another example of extending first right not being a matter of honor? Another example he said would be when you're crossing a bridge, to ask somebody else to go in front of you. I suppose the reason there is because every time you go on a bridge, it's a risk. So you say, you go first, not exactly honoring the person. Or even onto the roads, the only exception is when is it considered an honor to allow someone ahead of you to enter? It's when you're entering through a doorway where there is a mezuzah, there's an honorable doorway. Then you give somebody else the right to go in front of you. That is considered an act of respect. Halacha 13. Gomer little yedein v'nigvu yedein ubercha berchas hamazon ve'aviyas hamugmar. So here we're going to see that there were different customs around the benching, that they would bring some other types of things to kind of spice up the benching. So if they've washed their hands, they've dried their hands, they've now said benching, and they've brought the incense to be burnt. I guess it was a way of settling people, enjoying the smells. So, and of course, as we learned, you make a bracha also on when we take benefit from beautiful smells in this world. So he says, the person that led the benching should be the one to recite the blessing over this incense, and everybody else will answer amen. Halacha 14. If there was wine, and basically what he's referring to is that the ideal way, the best way to do the benching, brings honor to the benching, is to bench over a cup of wine. So you would fill the wine, and then it would be drunk after the benching, as is relatively common practice when we have a minyan, right? We spoke about a mezuzah requiring 3, and when you have 10, so you would also have a cup of wine. They would also sometimes mevi'in besamim. Besides for a cup of wine, they would also sometimes bring like leaves, nice smelling leaves. So the person that's leading the benching, he would hold the cup of wine in his right hand, in the leaves of this fine smelling herbs or whatever it might be, in his left hand. He would then do the benching. Then you say the blessing over the cup of wine, and then the blessing over these psamim, these nice smelling spices. Now, what happens if we were talking about a fragrant oil as opposed to leaves? Then, what he should do, he should apply it to the head of the attendant. In other words, you want to smell it, so you got to. I guess you were holding it in some type of drug, so you can apply it to the attendant. And the reason over here is, you'll remember when we learned in Hilchot Deot, the laws of fine character, that somebody of stature, the Talmid Chacham, should not walk around lathered, so to speak, in perfume, because it can lead to people assuming things about what they might be spicing themselves up for. So he says, so that's what we're talking about the gadol, the most important individual is benching, and they've got the oil, so that he shouldn't spread it on himself because he's going to go out and he's going to be all perfumed up. So he should spread it on the attendant. He says, what is if the person that attending is also Talmid Chacham? Then what you should do, you should spread it on the wall, because you don't want such individuals walking out into the marketplace, like we say, expelling this perfumed smell. Halacha 15, the final one in chapter 7. Even though to bench one does not require wine, in Berach al Yayin kaminag shamarnu, if you did bench over a cup of wine, as we've spoken about this custom, before you use it, you should wash it well, rinse it on the inside and outside. And he said, ideally, then you should fill it with undiluted wine. Right? In those days, they had a strong wine that was undiluted. But the undiluted wine was difficult to drink. So you should make the blessing, at least the first parts of the blessing, on this undiluted wine, but then you can add water enough, so to speak, that when you're going to make the blessing on the wine at the end and drink it, it should be pleasurable to drink. One conversation not be had over the cup of wine, right, that you're holding for the grace of meal, after meals for the benching, but you should remain silent after you finish benching, make the blessing on the wine, no talking, and drink it immediately. And with that, we conclude chapter 7.
Sorry, Rabbi.
Wonderful to see you.